Let's face it, Alysrazor was in a downward spiral long before we got involved. The late nights partying, the drug use, the self-destructive behavior. We knew she'd burn out eventually. I mean, you've heard what the tabloids are saying, right? Wait, you haven't? You really haven't heard? Why, everybody knows about the bird. Alysrazor is a 4-phase fight that repeats until the boss or your raid dies. Just like our 10-man guide, we'll be covering the fight as a 2-phase encounter. Alysrazor has around 150 million HP. Throughout the fight, you will also need to kill voracious hatchlings and blazing talon initiates with around 31 million and 2 million HP each. You'll want to bring 2 tanks, 6 to 7 healers, and a balanced DPS makeup. Alright, what's this bird do? Alysrazor begins the fight by knocking back all players with her Firestorm ability. This will deal mild fire damage to all players and tick for additional fire damage each second for a short period. The encounter area will also be blocked by walls of volcanic fire. Please, test them. At the start of the fight, and occasionally throughout Phase 1, Alysrazor flies over the center of the arena performing her Blazing Claw ability. This deals very high physical damage to all players in a wide cone in front of the boss. Each hit will also increase the player's fire and physical damage taken for a short time. As she does this, Alysrazor will begin molting, causing her to drop molten feathers across her path. Players can pick up the molten feathers, stacking to a maximum of 3 to gain buffs during the encounter. Movement speed is increased by 30% per feather, and holding just 1 allows players to cast spells while moving. Holding a maximum of 3 allows players to fly with the Wings of Flame buff. Flying players will need to contend with additional boss abilities in the air. Alysrazor will leave rings of fire in her wake as she flies. Passing through the rings will cause players to gain the stackable Blazing Power buff, increasing their haste by a small percentage with each stack. Passing through the rings will also replenish resources such as energy and mana and refresh the Wings of Flame buff duration. Players skilled enough to gain 25 stacks of Blazing Power will gain the Alysrazor buff, increasing their crit chance for 40 seconds. Alysrazor will leave incendiary clouds in the air as she flies around. Touching these will cause moderate fire damage. Players on the ground during this phase will need to handle adds. Blazing Talon initiates have 2 abilities. Brushfire creates a small ball of fire that travels along the ground in a straight line. It will deal moderate fire damage every second to any players hit by it. They will also occasionally cast a very high damage Pyroblast on the closest player to them. Each time an initiate successfully casts Pyroblast, their damage and casting speed is increased by 10%. Early on during Phase 1, 2 voracious hatchlings will spawn. Upon spawning, they will debuff the closest player to them with Imprinted. The hatchling will only attack the player they've imprinted, but this player will cause 1000% damage on all attacks to the hatchling. Occasionally, the hatchling will strike all targets in a small cone in front of them, causing a gushing wound. The target will bleed for mild physical damage 5 times a second for 1 minute, or until their health falls below 50%. Hatchlings will eventually become hungry, giving their melee attacks a 20% chance to throw them into a tantrum. While in a tantrum, the hatchling's damage and haste is increased by 50%. This debuff can only be removed by allowing the ad to consume a plump lava worm. Upon doing so, the hatchling becomes satiated for a short while and cannot throw a tantrum. Plump lava worms cannot be attacked by players and will only use the Lava Spew ability. This Frontal Cone Fire ability deals mild fire damage to all players in a short range. After being in this phase for a while, Alysrazor will begin to fly quick circles around the arena. Players with the Wings of Flame buff will have it removed from them and a fiery vortex will appear in the middle of the room. This, of course, deals very high fire damage to all players touching it. Shortly after, multiple fiery tornadoes will erupt from the vortex and begin racing around the arena. During this, more rings of fire will appear on the ground, giving players who pass through them the same Blazing Power buff from earlier. Soon, the boss will burn out and crash to the ground. While on the ground, Alysrazor will be unable to move and take 50% increased damage. Being hit by a spell also causes her to give off Essence of the Green, restoring 10% of the player's maximum mana per spell. Alysrazor will crash with 0 molten power, but her spark will cause her to gain 3 every 2 seconds. In addition to this, upon crashing, 2 Blazing Talon Claw Shapers will spawn. Each of these adds will attempt to channel molten power into the boss through their ignition ability. Once her molten power reaches 50, the boss will reignite. Alysrazor will begin to gain 3 molten power every second since she is now ignited. This lasts until she reaches 100 molten power. Her Blazing Buffet will deal mild fire damage to all players every second. During this, she will constantly swipe at the raid once again with her Blazing Claw ability. Once Alysrazor has reached 100 molten power, she is at full power and will deal moderate fire damage to all players and knock them back. At this point, Phase 1 will begin again and the fight repeats. Phase 1 is about correctly splitting DPS and dealing with adds efficiently. Shortly into the encounter, 2 voracious hatchlings will be dropped into the fight. Tanks must decide which add they will tank and stand next to its egg as it hatches. This will cause each tank to gain the imprinted debuff, allowing them to do 1000% damage to their hatchling. They will need this buff to do the DPS required to kill their add in time. While tanking the hatchlings, tanks will need to move them around to consume plump lava worms in order to keep the hatchlings from throwing tantrums. Be ready to use tank or healer cooldowns whenever hatchlings tantrum. 4 lava worms will spawn twice during each air phase. This means each tank can remove 4 tantrums. All other players should stay away from lava worms as to not get caught in their breath. Blazing Talon initiates will spawn 2 at a time around the arena. Split the ground DPS into 2 teams on separate sides. Each team will be responsible for handling adds on their side. Make sure to use interrupts on the initiates to keep them from pyroblasting and sending out brush fires. It is unlikely that DPS will have much free time between initiates, but if there is any, use it to help kill the voracious hatchlings. It is very important that the hatchlings die before the next phase of the encounter begins. Throughout the phase, Alysrazor will occasionally fly through the center of the arena, clawing at the air and cleaving any players in her path. Make sure not to be in the middle as this occurs. More importantly, once she is out of the way, more molten feathers will have been left behind. All players should attempt to get at least 1 feather before the next phase begins. Each feather increases movement speed, and having just 1 will allow spells to be cast while moving. Having 3 will allow players to fly, but this should be reserved only for the players assigned to DPS the boss during Phase 1. Alysrazor will drop 20 feathers at the start of the fight. This allows your raid to send up 6 players, preferably melee, and leaves 1 feather for each tank. By giving the tanks 1 feather each, they will be able to move hatchlings onto lava worms sooner. Flying players will begin the fight by immediately grabbing 3 feathers and pursuing Alysrazor into the air. Aside from DPSing the boss, their job will be to avoid the cloud she leaves behind, but fly through as many of the rings as possible. Each successive ring will buff the player as well as refresh the duration of their wings. This will continue until the start of Phase 2. At the start of the next phase, Alysrazor will begin to fly quick tight circles around the arena. As she does this, a fiery vortex appears in the center and players will have their wings of flame buffs snuffed out by the winds. After a short period, the vortex in the center will send out many more tornadoes and players will need to avoid being hit. This persists for a very short time and Alysrazor will eventually burn out. This is the burn phase. Alysrazor will crash with 0 molten power and will reignite and rise again when it reaches 50. The Blazing Talon Claw Shapers that spawn in this phase will attempt to channel more molten power into her. Have your tanks lock these mobs down to keep them from casting while the rest of your raid damages the boss. She will take extra damage during the burn phase and restore mana each time she is hit by a spell. Healers should make sure to DPS her, as doing so will refill their entire mana bar. Eventually, when Alysrazor reaches 50 molten power, she will reignite and begin to hover over the raid as she cleaves wildly. The tanks must pick her up and face her away from the raid. Raid damage will be very high, as fire damage will tick until she is back to her full molten power. The raid should rotate cooldowns such as Aura Mastery, Barrier, and Spirit Link Totem until she has returned to the sky. Once this phase ends, Phase 1 will begin again and the fight starts back at the top. Alysrazor is a very execution-based encounter. It is important to focus on exactly what you need to be doing and where you need to be standing at all times. It is easy to get confused by everything going on around you. Make sure to do your job well and stay focused until the boss dies. If you enjoyed this guide or found it helpful, bookmark us at LearntoRaid.com, subscribe to us on YouTube and Justin TV, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for checking us out here at LearntoRaid.com. We hope this guide was helpful, and we'll see you at the next boss.
I wasn't feeling so good. I just didn't feel like playing anymore. So I went home, and I got all comfy and cozy and all scrunched up in front of my phonograph.